In part 5 of this series, we covered the real distinction between actuality and potentiality, and we saw how these are important concepts for understanding change in the world. We saw that it was not satisfactory to understand a change as the actualization of non-being, or a derivation of actual being from non-being, for this would be nonsensical. It was also unsatisfactory to understand the terminus of the change as somehow already actual, for if an actual acorn were also already an oak, how could we intelligibly say that an acorn becomes an oak if it was already an oak? We are left with the reality of potential being, or potency, which is neither actual being nor is it non-being, but a real and latent feature of real things, such as acorns, men, cats, caterpillars, water, TNT, etc., which may be brought to actuality or actualized in the right conditions, such as if there is something with the power to actualize this potential being. Also recall I proposed 3 major directions one can take when addressing this question of change, which as far as I can tell are exhaustive of the possibilities. One can either affirm or deny the reality of change, but denying the reality of change lands one in an utterly static reality, and this denial of change would infest all of reality, not just extramental being, and would even include denying that one's own thoughts and cogitations could change. But if one's own thoughts and deliberations aren't changing, then it's simply impossible to reason through an argument to come to believe this position, for that would require stepping through one premise after the other and drawing a conclusion, which cannot be done if this position were true. And so one could never come to believe this position, and once he did begin to believe from not having believed it, he'd have refuted his own position, since that would require a change. This absolutely static reality not only obliterates reasoning for this position, but reasoning in general, for reasoning, at least in part, requires going through a succession of terms, concepts, judgments, also thinking about certain parts of reality, like evidence, none of which can be done if change were not real. But such thinking is required not just to affirm this position, but for any other endeavor, whether it be physics, learning a language, or stamp collecting. Denying change, therefore, would make it impossible to think about reality, and so the possibility of thinking about reality makes it absurd to deny the reality of change. But if we affirm the reality of change and deny the act-potency distinction, then this is tantamount to saying that only actual being truly has being. But in that case, on what grounds do we say that anything truly changes? Again, if we already have the actual oak here, in what sense can we say that an acorn becomes an oak if the oak is already actual? But in this view, apart from actual being is simply non-being, and we'd be forced to say that the oak comes from nothing, which is absolutely absurd, since non-being has no powers or capacities to actively cause or to passively be affected by anything, not being anything at all. And so we are left with the only possibility of both affirming change and affirming the act-potency distinction, in the face of positive arguments for the position and against the alternatives on the question of change. That's mostly review from part 5, but let me also add that this is not some silly abstraction, but this is a very deep insight into reality, in that the real natural substances of our daily experiences have certain potentialities built into them which are liable to be actualized, and so a complete understanding of these substances not only includes how they are currently, but what they can become, how they can change, what sorts of other substances bring about these changes, and also why certain substances reliably change in certain ways but not others. For example, a caterpillar can change into a butterfly, but a cat cannot change into a butterfly. The caterpillar has this real potentiality, but the cat has not. Water can be electrolyzed into hydrogen and oxygen gas, but the sodium chloride and table salt cannot. Water can be evaporated by a stove, but it cannot be changed into a bird by a stove. Certain substances have certain potentialities, but they don't have others, at least not at the natural level they don't. We take this for granted when we assume that certain things can be changed in a definite and restricted range of ways, and not just any old way that's so-called logically possible. And these modes of changing are reliably tied to the way these substances are. The reality of potential being makes much of this clear at the level of metaphysics. Also recall in part 5 we saw the necessity of saying that whenever a potentiality is actualized, when something changes, it must be due to another actuality. Some actual being must be responsible for the actualization of this potential, or potency being raised to actuality, to put it another way. For the alternatives are that potentiality or non-being are responsible. Non-being being responsible for actualization of a potential doesn't make any sense, since non-being isn't anything, and has no such powers to actualize, since if it did, it would at least be something. But could potential being, the only remaining possibility, be responsible for actualization? Potential being is not yet. It is not actual, and so cannot actually do anything yet, including actualize a potential. A potentially hot stove doesn't heat water, and its potentially high temperature cannot do something like burn your hand, though the stove could potentially be very hot. The electric current that a wire is potentially conducting cannot shock you or electrolyze water. A student's potential knowledge of Latin cannot reliably help him write in Latin. It simply makes no sense to talk about potential being doing anything until it is made actual, which is precisely the point. Only actuality can be responsible for the actualization of the potentiality. Furthermore, since something cannot be both actually and potentially in the very same way, it cannot be the very same actuality and in the same sense in which the thing is potentially that's responsible for the actualization. That is, though an acorn is potentially an oak, it would make no sense to appeal to the actual oak in the acorn to say why the acorn is changed into an oak. For if something is potentially an oak, it cannot also actually be an oak, since to be potential is precisely to not be actual in this respect. To say the actual oak is responsible makes no sense for another reason, for if the acorn is already actually an oak, what sense does it make to say that the acorn changes into an oak, which is the whole point of this inquiry? And so, we see the truth of the statement, whatever goes from potentiality to actuality must be actualized by another, or whatever is changed by another. But consider the nature of this actuality that's directly and per se responsible for this here and now actualization of a potential. Not in an accidental way, but what's directly and per se responsible for the actualization of this potentiality right now, such that if it did not here and now actualize, there just wouldn't be the effect in question, namely potentials being actualized. This would be the actuality such that if it did not actively actualize the thing being actualized in the passive sense, this thing being actualized would not currently be being brought to actuality from potentiality, for there would be nothing responsible for its being actualized. What we're after is the actuality that is directly responsible for the effect, the actualization of a potential, as opposed to going along for the ride in the accidental sense. For instance, when a brown stone breaks a window, it is the stone itself that deforms the window, if you consider what is actually to be held responsible for the window's passively being broken. It would not be true to say that the stone's brownness breaks the window, for the stone could just as well be black and it would still break the window. The color just goes accidentally along for the ride when the stone breaks the window, since a color as such does not break anything. It's true that the color does have actual being, whether it be black or brown or whatever, but this isn't the right sort of actual being to break windows, since colors have no such power, but stones do. Now, this actuality that's per se responsible for the actualization of the potential in X, let's call the actualizer A, can have this actuality in one of two ways, either derived or underived. Suppose it's the first option, that the actuality is derived by way of another, and thus goes from potential to actual. This means that another actuality, call it B, actualizes A, and A in turn actualizes X. Since B is a per se cause of A's actualization, and A is a per se actualizer of X, then the actualization of X depends on both A and B, since without B, A is not actualized, and has no power to actualize X. But the same question can be asked of B. Either it has its actuality, with which it is now the per se actualizer of A, in a derived or underived manner. But if it's again derived, then it derives this from another, call it C, which is now actively powering B, or actualizing B, so that B may actualize A, and A may actualize and change X. Now, note that X is not only dependent on A and B, but now on C, because C powers B, which actualizes A, and if C doesn't power or actualize B, then A cannot do anything, since A is concurrently actualized by B. So X depends on A, B, and C all together to be actualized. Notice it is no good to point to how something might have been in the distant past, since we're asking about what causes this actualization per se in the here and now, not remotely. And there must be such per se causes, because without them there is no effect, since to remove a cause is to remove the effect. It should be clear that there are only two options when following through the reasoning here. One, either there is an infinite series of per se actualizers responsible and adequately accounting for X's actualization, each of which has its actuality in a derived manner, Or 2. This series of per se actualizers and things actualized terminates with a most fundamental member, which is underived actuality, and powers others, but is not itself powered or actualized by another. Put it another way, something which has the power to change others, but is not itself changed or actualized in so doing. Its power is already actual in this sense, in that it does not go from potential to actual. Now, it would make no sense to say that the series terminates in something with derived actuality, since derived actuality just means derived from another, but that blatantly contradicts the supposition that the series has terminated. So in that case, you'd have a terminated series which is not yet terminated, which is just nonsense. So that should take care of the objection that what I just said above is a false dichotomy. But upon thinking about the nature of per se actualization and derived actuality, it should be clear that option 1, the infinite regress, is impossible and could never account for the reality of change, which is clear to experience. Consider an analogy. Suppose you're trying to power your computer, but you decide to plug it into a power strip instead of the outlet. Obviously, your computer won't work if you do only that, because the power strip doesn't power anything on its own. It only works when there's a source of power, which the power strip then redirects or channels. Only then can the power strip do anything, properly speaking. Without that source, the power strip doesn't do anything, and without a source, the channeler doesn't even have anything to channel. There's just no power to be channeled by the power strip. Suppose you plug this power strip into yet another power strip. Doesn't that work? Is your computer going to be powered now? Just plug into a third power strip. Or perhaps you might get a little silly and plug it into itself, which isn't going to do much of anything except cause people to laugh at you. Suppose you plug one power strip into another to infinity. Just one power strip plugged into another, and so on. If you could do this, would that be good enough to power the computer? Yes or no? The answer is clearly no. And just as 3 power strips plugged into another, an infinite multitude of them doesn't help the situation one bit. You cannot have an infinite series of things which only work insofar as they are powered ultimately by something like an electric generator to do much of anything, because the generator just isn't there in the infinite series of power strips, and so not a single one of those power strips could do anything. There's nothing that powers them, and there's no power for these power strips to channel, so they have nothing that could be channeled, and therefore aren't actually channeling anything. What's the lesson from that example? Go back to option 1, where we were talking about an infinite series of per se actualizers and things actualized, each of which has its actuality only in a derivative way. This is no more plausible than the infinite power strip example, for the relevant features are all there. You have an infinite series of things which can only actualize just as long as something else actualizes them here and now, but this in turn only actualizes as long as something actualizes it and powers it. On their own, they are powerless, since, by definition, they have only derived actuality. And in the case of the infinite series, there's no actuality actually derived, just as in the case of the infinite series of power strips, there is no electric power that is actually derived, and so there is no power in the entire series, even if it be infinite. We have here an infinite series, which doesn't actually derive any power, and no members get actualized, and therefore not one member of the series could actualize anything, just like not one of those power strips can do anything on its own. And if nothing can actualize anything, nothing can be actualized. And if nothing can be actualized, then nothing can change in the world. But clearly things do change in the world. Therefore, this option 1 must be false. Therefore, option 2 must be true. There must be that which has underived actuality, which powers or per se actualizes all other derived actualities here and now, but does not itself undergo actualization of potential, and thus is not powered by another. You might even say this reality just is power, and most truly is power, since it does not receive its power from another, but other things receive power and are actualized by it. But the force of this reasoning doesn't stop at the consideration of this or that particular actuality which can be traced down to that which actively powers in an underived manner, such as a window's being broken or an acorn's being actualized into an oak through successive stages in its growth. For when we reflect upon the nature of actual being has a way of being built upon and presupposing other actualities, without which other actualities cannot be actual. To put it another way, the active powers of things like physical substances presupposes the most radical and fundamental actuality, which is their very existence, since if they don't exist as non-being, they cannot do anything, much less be responsible for change in the world, since something that doesn't exist can't do anything. In this way, the actual agency of something when it actualizes a potential presupposes the very existence of the agency in question. For, again, if this agency doesn't exist, it cannot do anything. A non-existent rock cannot break window. The actual exercise of powers in question are built on and presuppose the very actual existence of the thing in question. To put it another way, they are built upon the fundamental actuality of the being's very existence, without which it cannot do anything, including be responsible for the actualizations of potentials. And so a complete account of potential being, actual being, and change must also take into account that first or most radical actuality of a thing, which is its very existence. With that in mind, let us now return to this thing which we established is an actualizer in an underived way, as opposed to deriving this power by way of another. Now, this ability to actualize, as we were saying above, is built on and presupposes the more fundamental actuality of this underived actualizer's very existence, the first or radical actuality of the thing. We may continue to reason likewise with this actualizer with underived actuality, in that either this thing possesses its radical or first actuality in a derived or underived manner. Suppose it possesses this actuality in a derived manner, in which case it would have to be actualized in some manner in order to exist, and have its actual existence by way of another, without whose agency it cannot even exist in order to be able to actualize. But in this case, we again see that when we consider this radical actuality of a thing, there are really either two options. One, either we proceed to infinity in things which derive their actual existence by way of another, or two, we must conclude that there is that which has its actual existence in a simply underived and already actual way, not requiring actualization in order to exist. In the second option, not only do we conclude that this not only has power in a totally underived or unactualized way, but exists or is in an unactualized way, simply put. And its first or radical actuality is unactualized. Rather, it just is actual, simply put, with no possible further qualifications on being potentially in some way, for it is fundamentally and radically underived actuality. However, we've reasoned above that option 1 once again doesn't make any sense, for the series of actualizers in this consideration also entails the existence of a hierarchical series of things subordinated one to another with regards to their existence, or a series ordered per se. If anything, it's even more ridiculous in this consideration because we're not just considering the active exercise of a power, but the root and primal actuality of this thing, which is its very actual existence, without which it can do absolutely nothing, for it would not even be at all, since each member in this series cannot so much as exist without the concurrent actual being of another. Therefore, option 1 is false, and the only remaining possibility is option 2, in which we conclude that there is not only that with underived power, but also underived actual existence to properly terminate this hierarchical series. And this is therefore radically and fundamentally actual, or purely actual, as we sometimes say. Nothing less than this can properly terminate this hierarchical series. As you've no doubt already seen in this series, we do not simply conclude that there is that which is purely actual and leave it at that, but we seek to inquire into what must be true of this pure actuality. We've already considered the distinction between essence and existence in previous parts, and it should also be clear that that whose essence isn't its own existence must be actualized in order to exist, and that essence is related to the active existence as potentiality is related to actuality. But this implies that that which is not actualized must have an essence which just is its own existence. Essence is just to say what a thing is, and given that pure actuality neither comes into existence nor passes from it, it may be said to be subsistent, and given its essence just is existence itself, we may also say that pure actuality just is subsistent existence itself. Now, would it make any sense to think of pure actuality or subsistent existence itself as some sort of composite being which requires the conjoining of parts in order to exist? It would not. For the very composition of parts into a whole is a sort of actualization of potentiality, in that the parts are actually incorporated into the whole as opposed to not being so incorporated. Therefore, that which has no potentialities to be actualized, and the most radically in its very existence, cannot be thought of as existing due to a composition of parts. That is to say, the existence of that which is purely actual is simple, that is to say, non-composite, and so radically simple that this simplicity pertains to its very being. And since no physical reality, or even collection of physical realities has this mode of existence. It must transcend the physical world, and can neither be any particular physical reality or a collection of them, and cannot be identified with either of them. There are a few attributes which should be clear from the very nature of the argument. One of them is that if there is that which is in a purely actual way, it does not depend for its existence on any other, and must necessarily exist, in the sense that it cannot fail to exist and cannot not be. There aren't any potentialities which require actualization in order for this to exist in the first place, and there are no potentialities which could be passively actualized in this purely actual thing for it to cease to exist. Simply put, the underived being of pure actuality precludes any talk of it beginning to exist or ceasing to exist. Furthermore, that which can be changed must have potentialities, for change just is the actualization of a potential. But this implies that that which has no potentialities cannot be changed in any sense. But pure actuality has no potentialities. Therefore, it cannot be changed. That is, it is absolutely immutable. Now, this also implies that it is without succession. That is, any sense of something coming before or after in pure actuality. This is because before and after here imply change, which cannot happen to something which is immutable. Given the argument involves reasoning from actual exercise of powers of things in the world, it should be clear that pure actuality entails having all powers, for nothing else could have powers except insofar as they trace back to that which has power in this underived manner. Therefore, it makes no sense to think of something else that exercises a power that pure actuality does not have. But to have all powers is just to say that pure actuality is omnipotent, once you translate English into Latin. We may argue for omnipotence in another way as well. Now, to have a power is to be able to make something happen and to communicate being to another. But that which is subsistent existence itself can communicate any being, since what it is just unlimited being. But to be able to communicate any being whatsoever is just to be omnipotent, and therefore that which is purely actual must be omnipotent. We may also conclude that that whose existence is simple must also be immaterial, for it belongs to being a material thing that it be made up of some quantitative amount of stuff. But to be made up of a certain amount of stuff is to entail being a composite being, that is, that it is made up of parts which could just as well adopt a different configuration or be broken apart. But all of this is contrary to that whose existence is simple and non-composite, for not having parts excludes being some sort of material being. Furthermore, whatever is material is subject to change, at least in possibility, and so that which cannot even in principle change cannot be a material being, since it has no potentialities, whereas it belongs to being material to have potentialities. Now, if there is that whose existence is utterly and radically simple, it follows that there cannot be many of such things. That is, there can be only one thing whose very existence is simple. For suppose, to the contrary, there were two or even more of such things whose very being is simple and devoid of parts. To be two or even many implies that these things are distinct in some way, otherwise they would not be many if they were not distinct. But to be distinct means that there's some part that one of these simple things has that the other has not, in virtue of which it is distinct from the others. But to have parts means to not be simple, rather composite. So the assumption that there are many entails that there is something which has parts and which does not have parts, which is nonsensical. Therefore, there cannot be many of such things whose very being is simple. So there must therefore be only one. Given that all powers owe themselves ultimately due to that which exists simply, and that there is only one, we conclude that it is the universal cause of all being, and is responsible for the very being or existence of everything other than itself, and is that in which every actuality finds its ultimate source, the very being of things most especially included, and is the primary locus for these actualities, or as we sometimes say, perfections. Being the universal cause of being also entails that so long as anything is, it owes its very act of existence ultimately to that which is purely actual and is an effect of it. But we may say that the way cause and effect link up like this constitutes a sort of presence of the cause with respect to its effect, in that so far as anything is, such as some object of a daily experience, its cause, namely that which is purely actual, must in some sense be present to its effect, because if it were not, the effect just would not exist, it would not be. Therefore, in this sense, there is nothing that exists which is not in some sense present to the universal cause of being. And it is in this sense that we may say pure actuality is omnipresent, which just means to be present to all things. On that same point, there cannot be said to be any sort of imperfection or something still lacking in this pure actuality, since no perfections could exist which don't ultimately find their source in pure actuality. It is in this sense we conclude that it must be perfect, and there is nothing wanting in the being of that which is purely actual. Not to mention that imperfection would entail that there's some sort of potentiality awaiting actualization to further perfect the thing, which simply cannot be the case in that which has no potentialities. From perfection in this sense, we may also conclude that pure actuality, given what it is in its nature, could not possibly be made any better. But we say that something is a good specimen to the degree that it is a perfect and actual specimen of its nature, and that a triangle is good to the degree that it is a perfect triangle. To put it negatively, to the extent it can be perfected as a triangle, the less good it is or the worse it is. So that which simply is the perfect active being itself and cannot be perfected in any way must be supremely good in this sense. It is often asked whether any aspects of so-called personality can be attributed to pure actuality. The answer is yes, and this follows straightforwardly from being omnipotent. For whatever is meant by, quote-unquote, being personal, it is a certain power or capacity to make something happen. Therefore, for this pure actuality to not have these powers, which are included under so-called being personal, would entail it is not omnipotent. So whatever is meant by being personal, it is implicitly included under omnipotence. The same for any other powers that are of interest to many people, which may accompany these concerns about so-called being personal. For it makes no sense to think of some power I have which isn't already sourced in some way in pure actuality. But notice we do not conclude that pure actuality is a person, quote-unquote. And this is not entailed by concluding that pure actuality has these powers which are included under the heading being personal. Pure actuality and the subsistent act of existence itself cannot be said to be a particular sort of anything or instantiation of anything. For what sense does it make for being itself to be a particular sort or instantiation of a thing? For it is prior to all that in the order of being. So the locution, quote-unquote, a person, is highly misleading and has to be highly qualified, whereas, at least in my opinion, to say that pure actuality has these powers of being personal is something we must say, given omnipotence. Now, I wish to point that out because sometimes it's claimed that classical theism denies that God is personal, which is false. What is denied is that God is a particular instantiation of anything, such as, quote-unquote, a person. Now, this same reasoning applies to when we ask whether we must attribute intellect and knowing to that which is purely actual. For whatever we mean by locutions like understanding, knowing, comprehending, etc., these designate certain things we can do or make happen, and as such they are powers. Again, all powers and perfections are going to have to trace their source back to that which is omnipotent, and these perfections are going to be present in pure actuality in some way, though they are not present in the same exact way. To put it negatively, there is no power that I have that pure actuality does not have in some way, or doesn't find its ultimate source in pure actuality, and this includes whatever we mean by knowing or understanding. Therefore, it follows simply from omnipotence that pure actuality can be said to have intellect or have knowledge. Another reason we must conclude that there is intellect in that which is purely actual is because the very essences and forms or universal patterns of things of our daily experience are caused to be by this universal cause of being, and therefore must pre-exist in it in some way, for whatever is in the effect is in some way contained in the cause. However, the universal cause of being isn't itself any one of these forms, in that it is not a particular dog or a tree or any other particular form. Therefore, it contains forms without itself being any one of those forms. But to contain form without being that form is just what the intellective act is, and what the faculty of intellect does. Therefore, we must conclude that that which is purely actual has intellect. But again, the analogical character of this knowledge must be recognized, and that which is purely actual does not, quote-unquote, know things in looking out upon forms which already exist in a way totally independent of pure actuality, and having those be in it in some way, without itself being any one of those particular forms. Rather, in the much more exalted way, which is to cause those very pre-existent forms to exist in the first place. And just as there can be no power that exists apart from pure actuality, there cannot be a form which either exists independently of pure actuality or isn't known by it in its being caused to be by pure actuality. Thus, we conclude that pure actuality must also know all there is, or be omniscient, to put it back into the Latin. Now, from the intellect and perfection in pure actuality, we may also say that truth is in pure actuality to its fullest extent, because intellect is perfected by truth. If that which was purely actual had not truth, but also had intellect, it could be further perfected by truth. But we've already established that it cannot be further perfected. Therefore, that which is purely actual must already have truth, and must be truth in its most perfect sense, as it is said to simply be goodness in its most perfect sense. Now, it is also reasonable to say that there is in the unactualized actualizer something analogous to will, or volition, or rational appetite. For since the unactualized actualizer is perfect, and is unlimited being by itself, the making exist of other finite being apart from it is not necessary for its perfection, and does not make the unactualized actualizer any more perfect. Strictly speaking, it doesn't need anything else to be what it is and to be further perfected, for it already is perfect. What this means is that, combined with its having intellect, it has a sort of freedom as to what should exist apart from it, and also a freedom with regards to whether anything else should exist apart from it at all, since, again, it is already perfect, and making other things exist doesn't make it any more perfect. But something with intellect and freedom of this sort must be said to have something analogous to will, since freedom of this sort in something with intellect naturally appertains to the will. And we may also say that not only does the unactualized actualizer freely will things to exist as opposed to not willing anything else to be at all, but also freely wills particular things to exist as opposed to other sorts of things. Now, from intellect, will, and various other attributes mentioned above, it is also very reasonable to say that that which is purely actual has life in an analogical sense. This is because, operating from analogy to finite things, nothing that is non-living is ever said to have intellect, much less rational appetite, that is, will. And it would be absolutely ridiculous to say that a non-living thing, like a boulder or cup of coffee, either knows or wills anything. And it doesn't matter how quantitatively big something is. It could be a galaxy, or even the whole universe, for that matter. For if it isn't alive, then it's dumb and doesn't know anything, much less want anything. As several atheists consistently say, the physical universe doesn't know anything and doesn't have any sort of intentions. But we have established that that which is purely actual has both intellect and rational appetite. Therefore, we must conclude that that which is purely actual must also have life. Moreover, this life must be eternal life, since we have just shown that there is no succession in that which is purely actual, and that it never comes into existence or passes from it, and is already perfect, and that nothing can be added to it. But eternity just is this complete possession all at once of everlasting life, so that that which is purely actual must also be said to have eternal life. We may also prove that it cannot have any accidental modifications, and therefore must be pure substance, without accidents. That is, that the unactualized actualizer isn't the subject for distinct being apart from substance inhering in it, such as the being of the redness of an apple doesn't exist at all on its own, but inheres in an apple, and the redness is an accidental modification and perfection of the subject, which is the apple. For it to have accidents is to be perfectible and modifiable, which entails the actualization of a potentiality, so as to have the accident actually inhere in substance, since accidents are a sort of actualization of substance, which stands in potentiality to receive inherent accidents. But the unactualized actualizer is not in potency to anything, in addition to having already proved that it is immutable, and therefore it cannot have any sort of accidents inhering in it, even if it's true that these accidents are not found apart from the substance in which they inhere. And since it cannot have any accidents, it must be pure substance, which would have being totally in itself and not in another, and not be subject to further modification of some additional or accidental being which inheres in it. And obviously, the unactualized actualizer cannot itself be a sort of accidental being, since accidents, by definition, have being only in another, and by way of another by inhering in substance. But the universal cause of being cannot have being in a derivative or dependent way, and so it makes no sense to propose that the unactualized actualizer has accidental being, or being in another. It must have being totally in itself. It must be pure substance, without accidents. Let us review. We have established that there is that which has not only underived actual power, but underived existence, and therefore exists in the most radically actually way possible. Furthermore, we have established that if there is that which is purely actual, then it must also be one, and not many, the universal cause of being, simple, transcendent, immutable, eternal, immaterial, without succession, exists of necessity, and that its essence just is existence itself, is omnipotent, is personal, omniscient, omnipresent, perfect, good, has rational appetite or will or volition, has life, and is pure substance without accidents, and is the fullness of truth. But for there to be that with all the above, which are called divine attributes, is just what it means for God to exist. Therefore, God exists. Now, once we take the time to understand what this argument is getting at, it will be clear that most of the stock objections directed against this argument have no force. Let's begin with the objection, who made God? Now, in the setting of the argument from change, this would be phrased as asking the question, who changed the unactualized actualizer? But change is the actualization of potential, and so this person would be asking, who actualized the unactualized actualizer? The response is simply that there is nothing which actualized what is unactualized, and it makes little sense to inquire into what actualizes the potentials and that which has no potentials to be actualized. This objection is erroneously thought to have force because the objector believes that the person making this argument is saying that everything is changing, or that everything is going from potential to actual, in which case it would require an actualizer. But that's not what we're saying. These are simply straw men of this argument, and these propositions are nowhere to be found in the premises of the actual argument, and it's only a sort of urban legend that they're there. Things require an actualizer because they go from potential to actual, and the argument only requires that at least some things are changing, and therefore require an actualizer. A similar response can be given if someone were to ask, why do you assume that everything needs a cause? We don't require such a thing. Only that the actualization of a potential be caused and requires a cause precisely because of that transition from potency to act, not just because it's a quote-unquote thing. Again, this is a misunderstanding of the argument based on the erroneous opinion that the premise, everything needs a cause, is actually a premise in the argument, which it is not. What if someone asks, well, what if the universe is eternal? Doesn't that undermine the argument? No. Since the argument from change is based on reasoning from actualization of a potential in a hierarchical series of actualizers, which must be operative here and now in order for there to be any change in the world at all. It isn't based on tracing actualizations backward in time to a first actualizer in the distant past, as would be done in an accidentally ordered series of movers. Even if, for the sake of argument, the universe never began to exist, in order for anything to change in the here and now, such a series of essentially ordered actualizers and things actualized would have to be operative in the here and now to adequately account for any change whatsoever. And so the argument does not depend upon the universe's having a finite duration in the past to work, because the argument is dealing with change in the here and now, not in the distant past. Other arguments, such as the Kalam cosmological argument, of course, do depend upon that, and seek to establish it, because it's one of the premises in the argument. But we're not talking about that argument here, so it's irrelevant for our purposes. I'll also mention that not one of the arguments that I presented or will present in this series will be based on the premise that the universe began to exist. What about the objection that, what if there is an infinite series of actualizers and things actualized? Well, this objection at least has the advantage of actually addressing something actually in the argument, but it will do the objector no good to simply ask the question, but he must respond to the arguments actually presented in this video and by other authors. If he's asking about what if there's an infinite series of actualizers extending back to the distant past, then this falls into the same confusion we just noted, where he believes the argument relies upon establishing that the universe has a finite duration in the past, or began to exist. But it does not rely upon this, only establishing that an infinite or indefinite regress of actualizers and things actualized, in which each actualizer would essentially depend upon another to actualize in this hierarchical series, is impossible. How about the objection that living things move and change themselves, so that would seem to contradict the premise that whatever is changed by another, or that whatever is actualized by another? No, this rests upon a misunderstanding of the metaphysics of that premise. The claim is that whatever goes from potential to actual must be actualized by another precisely because something cannot be both actually and potentially in the very same sense, for that would imply that something both is and is not in the very same sense, which is nonsense. But it is only required that some other actuality other than that which is in potential be responsible for the actualization. In living things which are corporeal, we have an organism where that actuality can be present in another part of the organism, and this can actualize another part. So it is not true to say that the organism, quote-unquote, moves itself in the sense that something is both actually and potentially in the very same way, but only in different ways, in different senses, and different parts moving other parts. Therefore, the reality of living things doesn't contradict the premise. For it to truly contradict the premise, one would have to say that something is and is not in the very same respect, which we do not say of living things. It is sometimes said that the argument from change essentially depends upon a false cosmology. But this is not true. The argument only depends upon the broadest features of physical reality, such as actuality, potentiality, and causation, which cannot be coherently denied in the philosophical study of physical reality. This should be clear from the premises in the argument, since no specific claims were made about cosmology, such as the common ones cited in Aristotelian physics, and it's not even assumed in this argument that the universe is finite in duration, as we've said before. It is also sometimes said that the principle of causality, whatever is actualized by another, contradicts Newton's laws of motion in classical mechanics, the first law of motion usually being the one cited. There is then the implicit argument that since they're in contradiction, at least one must be false. The objector believes Newton's first law to be more certain. The principle of causation must be false. But this argument fails from the start because the principle of causality is not in contradiction with Newton's first law. Newton's first law says that a body will continue to be at rest or in rectilinear motion unless acted upon by a net external force. The implicit argument goes that if an object is moving in a straight line, then the principle of causality entails the actualization of a potential. But Newton says it does not require an external force, and in fact entails that there is no net impressed force. But this argument assumes that the actualization of a potential can only be due to what Newton is calling a force. But this is a very dubious thing to say because the principle of causality isn't even talking about forces, and Newton isn't even talking about the actualization of a potential. The two statements never actually come into conflict because they're talking about two different subject matters, and so there is no formal contradiction between Newton's first law and the principle of causality, since it could very well be the case that rectilinear motion entails the actualization of a potential without the actualizers falling under the heading of so-called forces that are spoken of in classical mechanics. Now, much more can be said about what the connection between classical mechanics and the act-potency distinction is, but it suffices for the purposes of this video just to point out that the widely cited objection doesn't actually contradict the principle of causality because we're not talking about forces here, and Newton isn't talking about the actualization of a potential. What about the other widely cited objection that quantum mechanics somehow undermines the principle of causality? That because quantum states behave in an indeterminate way, then this somehow undermines the principle of causality. But notice, in the way the principle is formulated, it is not required that the effect be produced in a deterministic way, but only that whatever actualization that occurs is due to some actual being, whatever it may be, even if it's totally unknown, but the effect may conceivably come about in an indeterministic way. It is only required that the actual being produced is grounded in some actual being for the principle to be true. And so we see that this common objection simply doesn't touch the premise of the argument, and is based upon a misunderstanding of the metaphysics and the principle of causality. Of course, much more can be said about how actuality and potentiality connect to quantum mechanics, but that's not the purpose of this video. And again, it suffices to point out that the common objection is based upon an assumption that has been read into the principle of causality, which need not be the case, and thus the objection doesn't actually contradict the premise of the argument from change. Finally, one might claim that even though this argument does prove the existence of an unactualized actualizer plus divine attributes, he might say that this argument is no good because it doesn't prove Christianity true. It is right to say that the above argument does not prove Christianity true, but this is completely irrelevant, since the argument is not intended to do that, only establish that theism is true. And in general, it is not a good response to an argument for X to point out that it doesn't additionally prove Y if it wasn't an argument for Y in the first place, only for X. And whether it proves X is what the whole discussion is over, not whether it proves Y. My side of the discussion would happily concede that additional arguments would have to be added to argue for Christianity to the above argument, but it isn't required that the single argument argue for everything all at once. And at this stage, we are only arguing for the truth of philosophical theism, and the argument must be addressed on whether it succeeds in doing that, for if it does, atheism and naturalism are demonstrated to be false. And the next question is, where does one go given the truth of philosophical theism?